Hello everyone, welcome to your lecture on globalization as internationalization and universalization. This lecture is part of your paper on media and globalization. In this lecture, you will learn about the evolution of the concept of globalization and its relationship to media in the social sciences. We will address the many aspects of globalization, that is socio, economic, sociological, historical, cultural, demographic, technology and others. You will arrive at an understanding of the different dimensions and definitions of globalization. You will also study the various theoretical approaches across the social sciences that have examined the notion of globalization. This lecture will primarily help you to understand that globalization is multi-causal and a major area of inquiry. When seeking to define globalization in simple terms, one of the thoughts that first comes to the mind is whether globalization is something new or are imperialism and colonialism a precursor to globalization. During the period of imperialism, the world witnessed cultural, social and economic interactions between many European powers and the diverse colonized people. There were movements of resources, migration of people and mingling of ideas. Are these processes the foundation of the current period of globalization? When you hear the word globalization, what is the first word or image that comes in your mind? Is it a mode of transport such as an airplane or a ship, or is it some form of media such as television or the internet? Or is it a transnational company or objects of such branded such as clothing, soft drinks, etc., or the very idea of democracy? For many, globalization is represented in everyday objects such as jeans, detergents, fast foods, soft drinks or even films. For some others, the impact of globalization is understood as the world tending to sameness or removing differences in the way we speak, eat, drink, think, entertain ourselves and live our lives. We have seen broad changes in interactions between communities, regions and indeed the world. These changes have been accelerated lately, and this accelerated change is often referred to as globalization. Social theorists themselves differ about their ideas relating to the causes and consequences of globalization. However, there seems to be an agreement in the last 2 or 3 decades that globalization is what distinguishes this period from the earlier periods. The differences in approaching the concept of globalization poses new challenges to students of the social sciences, as the concept of globalization is not precise, yet it is used to explain everything from financial sector integration to social media. We will address some aspects in understanding the concept along with various theoretical stances. Let us begin with the economic characteristics of globalization. According to Joseph Stiglitz, an eminent economist, globalization is the closer integration of the countries of the world as a result of lower communication and transportation costs and reduction of man-made barriers to the movement of goods, services, people, capital, ideas and knowledge. Stiglitz considers a decrease in the telecommunication cost to be a very important factor in globalization. In his opinion, many developing countries have benefited through the ease in the access to markets and technology associated with globalization. There is a general agreement amongst the scholars in the social sciences that globalization is characterized by the processes such as financial sector integration, the accelerated growth of large transactional cooperations, creation of global markets, and rapid changes in the communication technologies. This is the view of the two Indian economists named Parekh and Shah. So, in simple terms, there are increased economic relations between countries, in part associated with the growth of the huge transactional cooperations and wealth flowing at an accelerated pace in the financial markets of the world. As discussed by Parekh and Shah, the depth of the global economy is evident from few trends. Number 1 can be that there is an increasing flow of financial capital across the countries. Second can be that there has been a rapid increase in private capital flows for direct investment and portfolio investment to developing countries in the decade 1990 onwards. The third can be foreign exchange trading, which has also seen a dramatic growth in this period. The share of international trade in the world output has also witnessed a rise. Even the manner of production is changed, whereby the producer is now able to divide up the production process into many geographical segregated areas. As Joseph Stiglitz suggests that globalization has both success and failures when examining the global economy. The successes of globalization can include the East Asian miracle from the 1960s. In his opinion, countries that were earlier marginalized have been reducing the gap between themselves and the earlier industrial countries as an aspect of globalization. For instance, China's GDP has witnessed a growth at 10% for the last 30 years. India, on the other hand, in the period following 2000 has witnessed a GDP growth up to 8%. However, everything about globalization is not a rosy picture. In fact, there are some failures associated with globalization, such as failure in increased inequality among the different countries. For example, in the case of economic growth of Latin America in the 1990s was half what it was earlier. It witnessed rising inequality, poverty, crime, and Africa is also another example of persistence of poverty. The transition of countries have experienced reduced incomes, rising inequality, and poverty. There are many problems faced by different developing countries in terms of gaps in their knowledge systems, unbalanced intellectual property rights, and global warming. The global north, which includes the USA, Western Europe, developed Asia, Australia, New Zealand, and even though they are in the southern hemisphere, is the polluter, but the underdeveloped global south faces the consequences. Because developing countries became late to the development race, they have to look at more expensive sources of energy to fuel their development as fossil fuels have been used up. Another issue is that of global governance, which is seen undemocratic and more authoritative in nature. What can also be observed is the domination by the global north, which have pressurized developing countries to accept market fundamentalism, often at the cost of the interests of different developing countries. Economic globalization has preceded political globalization, so the nation state is affected. Before we move to study other dimensions of globalization, let us do a quick revision. In this part, we learned the explanations of economic characteristics of globalization as given by Joseph Stiglitz, Parekh and Shah. While Stiglitz emphasized on lower communication and transportation costs and the reduction of man-made barriers to the movement of goods, services, people, capital, ideas, knowledge as an important causes to globalization, Parekh and Shah on the other hand highlighted some of the evident trends of globalization, such as an increasing flow of financial capital amongst the countries, rising share of international trade in the world output, and the change in the manner of production whereby the producer is able to divide up the production process into many geographically segregated areas. All these scholars, however, highlight that globalization has some success as well as few failures. Successes such as countries that were earlier marginalized have been reducing the gap between themselves and the earlier industrialized countries. In terms of failure, there is witnessed an increase in inequality among and within some countries. This failure is caused by the gaps in the knowledge system, unbalanced intellectual property rights regime, and global warming. Now let us move on to the socio-cultural characteristics of globalization. As indicated earlier, globalization is not merely an economic phenomena, but also a social and a cultural one. Held suggest that globalization is a process or a set of processes which embodies a transformation in the spatial organization of the social relations and transactions accessed in terms of their extensity, intensity, velocity and impact, generating transcontinental or inter-regional flows and networks of activity, interaction and the exercise of power. It is worth noting that these social theories take cognizance of the dimensions of power and believe that globalization is a process that transforms social relations and transactions. Globalization is also defined in the broad terms as the compression of time and space by eminent sociologists such as Giddens, Robertson. Anthony Giddens believes that globalization is a consequence of modernity. He believed that the current period was one of the late modernity rather than post-modernity because the world had moved to the stage where the consequences of modernity were becoming more radicalized and universalized than before. Giddens expresses this view that distinction and disembedding are the reason for the space and time compression. Distanciation is the idea which explains how time and space are categorized to connect presence and absence. Disembedding, on the other hand, refers to how social relations are changed from the local context and reconstructed over time and space. Writing at the same time, the Indian social theorist Arjun Appadurai has also explored the process of globalization. His work, while recognizing the importance of culture, believes that globalization is multi-causal. He talks about the importance of the following 5 landscapes in conjugation with globalization. To sum up, Appadurai says, the 5 terms I have coined set the basis for a tentative formulation about the human condition under which global flows occur. They occur and in through the growing disjunctures between ethnoscapes, technoscapes, financiascapes, mediascapes and ideoscapes. It is also suggested by political scientists that globalization has brought the nation state under pressure. Nation states are now seeing their power leak away to the global bodies and political actors whether it is government or different corporations. They are also under threat from the subnational entities such as the civil society groups and even the media. Therefore, in this part, we learned about another dimension of globalization. Through the explanation by the eminent sociologist Anthony Giddens, we understood that globalization is as compressed of time and space. We understood that time and space compression through the concepts of distanciation and disembedding. The multidimensional definition by Indian scholar Arjun Appadurai explained the multi-causal nature of globalization. We have seen so far some aspects of globalization as formulated by economists and sociologists. The global village idea by Marshall McLuhan has been echoed in more current writing on globalization. The idea of the whole world being one, whether for advertising purposes, environmental issues, genetic research, or even problems such as terrorism or AIDS, point at our commonality. The idea that we are becoming more the same also brings the idea of cultural imperialism, the view that dominant countries or corporations are imposing their views and products on other weaker nations or people. This view is broadly what is called the homogenization and universalism view of globalization. It implies that as a result of globalization, local cultures will be under threat as people will turn to usually Western forms of production and consumption. On the other hand, the heterogenization view, which includes theorists such as Edward Said, Homi Bhabha and Stuart Hall, who can be considered to be the postmodern scholars in their approach. These theorists do not endorse the idea of a world system. They see renewed importance in the category of local as contrasted with global. They point out the resistance and uniqueness of cultures and people and about power dimensions. One way of bringing together these very different viewpoints is via the concept of globalization and hybrids. Robertson coined the terms glocal or globalization to mean a blend of the global and the local, or the universal and the particular. In this fashion, globalization can explain things as different as Masala Tikki burger, which is an Indian version of the global chain McDonald's popular burger. The current era sees that global and local are combining in the different structural and cultural waves to give rise to new hybrids. In this way, both the universal and the particular are brought together. In this part, we studied two conflicting viewpoints of homogenization and universalism vis-a-vis heterogenization. The scholars of homogenization viewpoint believe in the idea of cultural imperialism. They suggest that as a result of globalization, local cultures will be under threat as people will turn to usually Western forms of production and consumption. While the scholars of heterogenization viewpoint such as Edward Said, Homi Bhabha, Stuart Hall point out to the resistance and uniqueness of cultures and people and about power dimensions. Finally, we addressed the third point of view that brings together these very different viewpoints through the concept of globalization or globalization and hybrids. It suggests a growing trend of local or globalization, which means the blend of global or local or the universal and the particular. Global media is also a part of globalization. Satellite broadcasting, which was developed and expanded in the 1970s, has been a big agent of change. The communication satellite placed in the geostationary orbit, which is particular orbit of 22,000 miles above the Earth's surface, can cover 1/3 of the Earth's surface with its signal or footprint. Transnational media companies expanded their reach and spread into Eastern Europe and other formerly communist countries with the imploding of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. Herman and McChesney believe that the national media industries have been impacted and have had to respond to the appearance of a global commercial media market since the 1980s. In their view, fewer than 10 mostly US-based media conglomerates dominated the global market in the 1990s. The rate of mergers and acquisitions speeded up part of the general trend of conglomeration, resulting in giant corporations in the 1990 to 2000. Across the world, state-owned post, telegraph, telephone companies were privatized or either liberalized. The same processes have been at work in a global commercialization of television. Another aspect of global media is the increased importance of advertising and the reduction in the importance of the public service broadcaster. The development of new media and even social media have revolutionized communications. The new media has deepened the processes of globalization at an accelerated pace. The internet and the mobile telephone have impacted everything from culture to politics, commerce to governance, and many more. New media have enabled faster than ever interactions on a global scale that is unprecedented. Statistics state that in early 2017, India and China had over 2 billion mobile penetration, making it more connected nation than ever before. Currently, barely 30% of the Indian population is connected to the internet. However, this is likely to change in the coming decade as connecting to the internet via low-cost smartphones are at the fastest growing segment in terms of connectivity. Thus, I hope that through this lecture you have become familiar with the different aspects of globalization, namely economic, social and cultural, and gained an insight into the views of theorists from across the spectrum of the social sciences on the nature of globalization. These theorists have, however, been divided on whether the world is tending towards the universalism or homogeneity, whether heterogeneity will prevail or whether globalization and other hybridity will be the order of the day. However, I do hope that you have learned that globalization is a multi-causal phenomena and cannot be reduced to any one specific spectrum. For more details, please read the text and of the module very carefully and attempt the questions in the end. Thank you.